Welcome to The Explainer. Today, we're diving into a truly incredible breakthrough. We're going to look at exactly how modern forensic science has officially solved a 52-year-old mystery involving one of America's most notorious serial killers, Ted Bundy. The march of technology is relentless, right? And as we're going to see, it actually has the power to reach back decades to bring the truth to light.
Okay, let's dive into this. Before we even touch the science and the timelines, we absolutely have to start with the human element. Listen to this recent reflection from the sister of the victim, Laura Ann Aime. She was just a 12-year-old girl when her 17-year-old sister was taken from her. For decades, this family waited for a definitive closure. Her gratitude toward the modern evidence team highlights exactly why this kind of retrospective police work is just so incredibly vital. And that brings us to this staggering number, 52. That's the number of years this family spent in a painful limbo, just waiting for definitive, undeniable answers. Think about that for a second. Half a century of wondering, hoping, and grieving. To really wrap our heads around the gravity of this, we have to go all the way back to 1974. That was the year 17-year-old Laura Ann Aime was brutally murdered. Her body was eventually discovered buried in American Fork Canyon in Utah. At the time, an investigation was launched, sure, but law enforcement simply didn't have the tools they needed to definitively close the case. Section 1, a cross-country reign. Looking at Ted Bundy's timeline reveals a really dark legacy. From 1974 to 1978, his reign of terror completely rocked the country. Then, following a highly publicized trial, he was sentenced to death in Florida in 1979 for the murders of 2 college students and actually given another death sentence that same year for the rape and murder of a 12-year-old girl. A decade later, in 1989, he was executed by the electric chair. Yet, it took until present day for Laura's case to be officially closed. Bundy's dark legacy has haunted this country far, far longer than his actual active years. The sheer scale of his crimes is terrifying. Investigators suspect he may have been involved in the rape and murder of at least 36 women. And there was a chilling pattern to his madness, too. His victims were all young, and they all had long brown hair, much like Laura Ann Aime.
So the crucial point here is that the number of actual confessions doesn't match the number of suspected victims. Bundy only confessed to 30 of these murders, and he literally waited until the very night before his execution in 1989 to do so. This last-minute partial confession left massive gaps in the legal record, basically denying full legal closure to so many families.
You might be wondering, why was he so incredibly hard to catch and convict for all his crimes? Well, because he was a master at hopping from jurisdiction to evade 1970s law enforcement. He moved across Washington State, Oregon, Colorado, Utah, and eventually Florida. He would commit terrible acts and then just dump his victims' bodies in remote areas miles away, like the woods of Lake Sammamish State Park in Washington, causing unimaginable heartache wherever he went. We actually get a glimpse of his terrifying methods from a Washington native who survived being kidnapped by him. She recalled her life flashing before her eyes when he told her, "Don't even go there, you're never getting out of here." Decades later, she still states she feels more than lucky thanking God every single day that she's alive. Criminologist expert Dr. Joseph Sillo of St. Leo University in Pasco County has studied this extensively. He notes that Bundy was essentially born to be a serial killer. He was completely addicted to sexual violence and reliant on instilling terror in his victims to get satisfaction. Sadly, Laura Ann Aime's murder fit this exact gruesome profile. Section 2. Justice for Laura. And this brilliantly illustrates a key question. Why wasn't the case closed before? While Bundy did admit to Laura's murder right before his execution in Florida, a confession by a known, notorious manipulator on the eve of his death was deemed to be just not enough evidence to close the case legally. Compare that to today. Investigators used new DNA technology to provide definitive, undeniable proof. The hard science accomplished what a killer's words never could. Section 3. The DNA breakthrough. It really all comes down to what the Utah County Sheriff described as pristine evidence. Back in the 70s, 80s, and 90s, the DNA evidence technology needed to definitively tie these crimes and people together simply didn't exist. However, the biological material collected from the crime scene back in 1974 was perfectly preserved. It endured 52 whole years in a state intact enough that today's forensic investigators could extract a definitive DNA profile. They finally proved, beyond a shadow of a doubt, who the murderer was. But, while the science is totally objective, the deeply personal impact remains. For the families, the anger and the need for retribution are emotions that outlast any timeline, and a clinical DNA match doesn't just erase the pain. Getting the definitive answers they deserve is monumental, for sure, but that heartache, it never truly goes away.
Section 4. More cases to come? This single breakthrough is already having a massive ripple effect. Utah County Sheriff Mike Smith announced that the new definitive DNA profile developed for this case is now going to help other jurisdictions attempt to solve their own cold cases. Jim Fuda from Crime Stoppers also points out that these advancements in DNA preservation and profiling aren't just about this one perpetrator. This is the exact same kind of technological evolution that helped law enforcement catch other notorious killers, like Gary Ridgway. It's a real game changer. Now, what's really interesting, and honestly a bit unsettling, is the consensus among experts right now. Both Dr. Sillo and active detectives agree on one chilling fact. This is not the end of the story. Because he was such a master at moving from jurisdiction to jurisdiction, experts firmly believe there are still undiscovered bodies out there, and unsolved cases that will eventually be linked back to Ted Bundy. So, what does this all mean for the future? Well, the relentless march of forensic science means time is no longer a perfect shield for the guilty. If perfectly preserved, pristine DNA can offer a grieving sister closure today, how many more undiscovered victims across the country are finally about to get their justice? Science is rapidly catching up to the past, and for families still weeding in the dark, that is a
Okay, let's dive into this. Welcome to The Explainer. Today, we're taking a look at the historic closure of a decades-old case that has literally haunted investigators and families for over half a century. We're going to break down exactly how modern science finally managed to definitively catch one of America's most notorious serial killers, Ted Bundy, one more time.
52. It's a staggering number, right? But it isn't just a statistic. This represents the agonizing years that the family of 17-year-old Laura Ann Aime waited for answers about her 1974 murder. For over 5 decades, they were stuck in this horrific limbo. That is an entire lifetime of waiting, hoping, and just wondering if the truth would ever officially come to light.
Section 1. A 52-year mystery solved. So, just recently, Utah authorities officially tied Ted Bundy to Laura's death, firmly closing a case that had been sitting ice-cold since the mid-1970s. But to really understand why this matters, we have to anchor ourselves in the human emotion here. Laura's sister said it best. "I was 12 when Laura died. She was 17, but we were really close." Imagine being a 12-year-old girl, losing your older sister, and having to wait until you're well into your 60s to finally get an official resolution. The immense relief, combined with the reopening of those deep wounds, it's just profound.
Section 2. Bundy's reign of care.
To fully grasp the magnitude of this breakthrough, we really need to understand the sheer scale of his crimes. Investigators were up against incredibly vast hunting grounds. We're talking Washington, Oregon, Colorado, Utah, and Florida. As Dr. Joseph Sillo, an expert who studied this case extensively, notes, Bundy was a disturbing master of jurisdiction hopping. He didn't just stay put. He actively moved across the country to evade detection, crossing state lines, and totally taking advantage of the fact that local police departments back in the 70s just weren't communicating with each other.
Let's walk through the timeline to see how this all unfolded. From 1974 to 1978, he went on this horrific cross-country crime spree. It wasn't until 1979, after a highly publicized trial, that he was finally sentenced to death in Florida for the murders of 2 college students and later a 12-year-old girl. 10 years after that, in 1989, he was executed via the electric chair. So his active period was relatively condensed, but the trail of terror he left behind, that is still actively being unraveled today.
Which brings us to a really chilling number, 36. Now, the night before his execution, Bundy confessed to 30 murders. But authorities, including those who've been working these files for decades, suspect he was actually involved in the rape and murder of up to 36 young women. Almost all of them shared a similar physical profile, young women with long brown hair. But because of his evasion tactics, that exact number has always been a haunting question mark.
Section 3. The 1974 Utah murder.
17-year-old Laura Ann Aime was subjected to a truly gruesome attack, and her body was eventually discovered in Utah's American Fork Canyon. It was a horrifying scene that completely matched the vicious MO of the killer terrorizing the region. Now, what's really interesting about this is, a death row confession wasn't enough to officially close the case. If Bundy confessed to 30 murders right before he was executed, why on earth did this take 52 years? Well, he actually did claim responsibility for Laura's murder in that final confession. But from a legal and investigative standpoint, the confession alone lacks sufficient physical evidence to officially, irrefutably, close the case on the books. They needed actual proof, not just the word of a serial killer trying to buy himself more time.
Section 4. The power of DNA. Back in the 70s, 80s, and even into the 90s, the lack of sophisticated DNA evidence severely limited investigators. I mean, they had physical clues, sure, but they couldn't bind a suspect to a scene on a molecular level. Compare that to today, where advanced technology successfully leverages preserved DNA. It's literally a night and day difference in how law enforcement operates and solves crimes. Modern forensic technology finally stepped in to provide the definitive proof that a confession just couldn't.
So the crucial point here is how this DNA survived at all. The term investigators use is pristine evidence. Basically, this means physical material from the crime scene endured the passage of 52 years without degrading. Because the evidence collection team in 1974 properly secured and preserved those samples, modern scientists were able to extract a profile. Jim Fuda with Crime Stoppers actually pointed out that this exact same concept, preserving swabs and biological evidence way before the technology even fully existed, is exactly how investigators eventually caught another infamous Washington serial killer, Gary Ridgway, the Green River Killer.
The real-world application of this is just incredible. Utah Sheriff Mike Smith emphasized that by developing this definitive DNA profile for Bundy in the Laura Ann Aime case, they've created a powerful new tool. This specific high-quality profile will now actively help other jurisdictions compare their own unsolved cold cases against it. So by closing one case, they've potentially unlocked the door to closing several others.
Section 5. Closure and lingering pain.
Listen to this absolutely harrowing quote from a Washington woman who actually survived being kidnapped by Bundy. She recalled him telling her, "Don't even go there, you're never getting out of here." She said she knew her life was flashing in front of her. This wasn't just some puzzle to be solved in a lab, right? This was stark, unimaginable terror inflicted on real people. The profound trauma heavily outlives the killer himself.
Now, pair that survivor's terror with this reaction from Laura's sister upon finally getting the news. She said, "Just to know that Ted Bundy is gnashing his teeth in hell, that's what they deserve." It's such a powerful emotional pivot. It really shows us the incredibly bittersweet, angry reality of finally getting closure. It doesn't bring her sister back, obviously, but there is a distinct, fierce satisfaction in knowing the truth is absolutely undeniable now.
Section 6. Uncovering more cold cases.
So, what does this 52-year-old breakthrough actually mean for the future of forensic science in our justice system? Well, according to Dr. Sillo's psychological analysis, Bundy was fundamentally addicted to this behavior. He couldn't get sexual satisfaction without the violence and terror. He was essentially born to be a serial killer and was entirely consumed by his compulsions. Because of this relentless addiction to violence, pinning down his true final victim count is incredibly difficult. He didn't just stop, he was stopped. Which leaves us with this incredibly haunting question. Are there more victims out there? Could there be more families who have been waiting 40, 50, or even 60 years for a phone call from investigators? The scale of his travel and the timeline of his active years heavily suggest that the official count of 30 might just be scratching the surface.
And here's the provocative thought we're going to end on today. Experts firmly believe there are still undiscovered bodies and unsolved cases linked to Ted Bundy out there. But the ultimate takeaway is this: science is actively righting these historical wrongs. Because of pristine evidence preservation and the relentless advancement of DNA technology, there's a very high probability that more of these cold cases will be solved. The science is finally catching up to the past.